Welcome everyone to class number 9. This is regarding the power of the people, how the Jewish laws, the new Jewish laws, meaning the ones that were instituted in later generations, how they channel and yet do not contradict to the ancient wisdom of the Torah. So this is going to describe customs as well as rabbinic institutions, which are practical till this very day, and how do they coincide with the existence of the written Torah and with the fact that God does not want us to change the written Torah. So we'll start over here with the introduction. Sheila, if you'd like to read the first introduction.
Did you know that lighting candles on Friday night, setting the Seder plate on Passover, reading the Megillah on Purim, and lighting the menorah on Hanukkah are not actually mitzvot in the Torah? Rather, they are all rabbinic enactments. So who gave our sages and rabbis the power and authority to legislate and enact laws, and under what circumstances?
Very good. So these are from the most famous times, from most famous practices in Judaism till this very day, including the Friday night Shabbat candles, the Seder plate, meaning the way we set up a Seder plate, the fact that we eat matzah on the night of Passover, that's biblical. But the Haggadah and the whole system and how we go through an organized 15-step program, that is a rabbinic enactment. The holiday of Hanukkah, one of the most famous Jewish holidays, is not mentioned in the Torah. Of course, it happened much later. So these are Jewish customs, very popular ones, and yet they were instituted by rabbis. So we're going to go through and explain what is a rabbi allowed to do, how is he allowed to do it, what gives them the authority in general, and when is their authority taken away, even if they introduced something new. So let's start with big idea number 1. Caroline, if you'd like to read this page, and then I'll pull up the next one momentarily.
Okay, a perfect Torah. Big idea number 1. The written Torah is divine and perfect. Therefore, there is a prohibition for later rabbis to add or subtract mitzvot.
So we're laying down the foundation here, and that is that the written Torah, we mentioned this prior, but now we're going to bring it down again. It cannot be amended or changed even by all and the greatest rabbis. No one has the authority to change the Torah. Let's see this idea. We'll first start with a few questions. So let's start, Caroline, if you'd like to read some of these questions and give us your quick answer.
Okay, what was one of the most significant turnarounds in your way of thinking? That everything has an order and a purpose, and there's part of keeping that order and purpose is part of the obedience equation.
Okay, that's beautiful. Now follow up question 2.
Why did you change your mind?
Meaning, assuming that you used to not believe that. You used to not believe that everything has a purpose. What made you change your mind?
Well, it's like, I guess maturity, you get older. It was always like selfish, I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care. But now you think like, what does God want?
Very good. Okay.
And what was the original state of mind for me or for anyone?
Yeah, for you. So you partially answered that when you were younger, it was more of the selfish, immature.
Yeah, more rebellious.
Okay.
What is your altered current state of mind? I'm always checking myself, and it's like I catch myself like, do you really need to be saying this or doing that? It's like, so I'm maturing.
Very good. Okay, so now let's read, based on what you just said, that humans are always changing our minds. We have turnarounds. We have things that we believed once prior, and then we change our mind. Based on that question, how would you answer this? Does God change his mind? Meaning, does God also mature, get a little bit more smarter, and say, oh, you know what? I used to think not everything is run by me, but now I know that I run everything, or other factors that God becomes a little wiser? Or do we assume that if he's God, past, present, and future is all the same.
He can change his mind.
So we mean in the sense, you're right that it does say in the Torah that God regretted to a certain degree. He felt bad that he created man. That's a big example that's used. But even then, the way it's explained is that imagine when someone has a child is born to them. They're extremely happy and excited. And then if that child passes away, they get very sad and depressed. If someone were to ask him when the child is born, why are you so excited if you know that one day this child will pass away and it'll be sad? The obvious answer is yes, I know that there will be a sad time, but now during a happy time, I'm happy. And when the sad time comes, I'll be sad. I'm not going to refrain from being happy during a good occasion because of knowledge of the future. So too with God, when God says that he had second thoughts or regretted the fact that he created man, of course he was aware from the beginning that this is going to happen. He said it himself. However, he was at the time of creation happy and felt it was worthy to create, and he knew it's going to come a time when he won't be happy with creation. But regarding this context, what we're saying that humans, we have turnarounds because we get a little wiser. We come a little smarter. God is eternal. He doesn't change his mind, putting the word mind in quotations, because of course God doesn't have a mind the way we have it. Even using the phrase God's mind as if God is just a bunch of humans, just a little smarter than them put together, that itself is an injustice to God. God is above our understanding, and he doesn't not know something and only learns it later. He knows it all. So therefore, God doesn't change his mind, and therefore, the Torah, which is God's wisdom, God's commandments, never changes. So just to clarify again, to recap what this idea is trying to bring out, we mentioned over here that the written Torah is perfect, meaning God's word is perfect, and we as humans, we went through these questions, we change our mind because we learn new things. We think we know it all till we find out we don't. God always knows that he knows it all. And so therefore, he doesn't need and doesn't ever change his mind. And he tells us this clearly in the Torah. Let's read this. Sheila, if you'd like to read from Do Not Tamper till the end of the page.
Do not tamper with perfection. The Torah itself affirms the fact that the Torah of God is complete, perfect, and therefore cannot be tampered with. Deuteronomy. And now, Israel, give heed to the laws and rules that I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the God of your fathers is giving you. You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of God that I enjoin upon you.
Very good. So we're going to highlight these words where this is a clear verse in the Torah. You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it. Meaning God warns us and he says, don't become any more religious than me. Don't think that I wasn't aware of what's going to happen and think that you need to add more stuff. And also, don't think that you're more enlightened than I was 3,000 years ago and say, oh, you know what? God had a great idea for those times. These day and age, we have to be a little bit more modern. God says, my commandments don't change. So in response, based on what you just read, what's the answer to this question, Sheila?
What are we not allowed to do to the Torah? Change it at all.
Very good. Very good. Right. So now comes a question one might ask, okay, you know what? I understand you're not allowed to subtract from the Torah because I'm claiming to be a little smarter than God, but why not add to the Torah? What's wrong with saying, you know what, God was saying the minimum, I'm adding on more maximum. I'm adding on and saying there's greater things that we can do. So let's read over here. This is from one of the basic Jewish philosophy books. He discusses this idea. And Caroline, if you'd like to read Maimonides and then text 2.
Okay. Maimonides and Sefer Icharim explain that we are not allowed to add or subtract from Torah because the Torah is perfect. Text 2. The explanation for the mitzvah of you shall not add is provided in the book to guide to the perplexed. It is impossible to add or subtract something from a perfect and complete system without ruining it. Insomuch as the Torah is complete and perfect, as the verse states, the Torah of God is perfect. It is impossible to change over time, though the addition or subtraction of mitzvot. This is the point of what the Maimonides writes in several places.
Yeah, you read good. So he says here that because it's God's Torah and God is perfect, and the verse says clearly, this is a quote from Psalms chapter 19, the Torah of God is perfect, therefore adding is just as offensive to God as subtracting, as if God wasn't aware of something and you as a human creation knows the real truth, knows a deeper level. Let's read again text 3. Sheila, if you'd like to read over here, Maimonides.
Maimonides lists the immutability of Torah as item number 9 on his list of 13 principles of faith. Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah, introduction to the Sanhedrin, chapter 10. The 9th principle is cancellation. This means that the Torah of Moses will never be reformulated or replaced, and no other Torah will be revealed besides it. And one should not add to it or subtract from it, neither the written Torah nor the oral Torah, as the verse states. You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it.
There you go. So this is an extremely fundamental commandment from the Torah. That's why Maimonides, when he has to choose just 13 principles of what the Torah is teaching us, if you wanted to sum up the principles of Judaism, one of them, Maimonides finds important to put in, that the Torah will never change. And this was actually a very heated debate between Jewish scholars and non-Jewish scholars from other religions. When they had debates, they would bring up this subject. And this was a very touchy and something that one can discuss for a long time. Is there a new version of God's Torah? So this commandment that the Torah doesn't change is so fundamental. Why? Because without it, you're left with nothing. Rules have to be rules in order to be kept. So this mitzvah of the Torah not changing was used in debates with Christians, with Muslims, whenever rabbis were forced into these types of debates, which happened a lot in the medieval century. This was the topic that the rabbis would say very often, that the Torah tells us it cannot change. So coming and saying that there's a new updated version and that God changed his laws and there's things that are amended, that is not what we call a bris, a covenant with God. A covenant means that it doesn't change. God tells us no need to worry. Let's use a parable before we get on to the summary. There's an interesting parable that is brought down to explain how adding to the Torah can sometimes be just as detrimental as subtracting. They say there was a fellow, Chaim. He goes to his neighbor, Yankel, and he says, Yankel, I would like to borrow from you a silver spoon. Now, Yankel was a very wealthy man, and he had silver spoons, but he was a miser. It really bothered him to separate from anything that he owned. But reluctantly, it was his neighbor. He felt uncomfortable. He wasn't able to say no. So he gives him the spoon. A few days later, Chaim comes back to his neighbor Yankel. He returns to him his spoon, and he brings him a smaller spoon as well. And he says, here, please take back your spoon. So Yankel says, Chaim, I lent you one spoon. What's this small baby spoon that you're giving me along with it? He said, you wouldn't believe it. I had your spoon in my house. I put it in the drawer. The next day I woke up and your spoon had a baby. So I'm returning to you the baby. So this Yankel says, listen, he's crazy, but if it's for my benefit, please let him go ahead. Sure, no problem. He said, whenever you need to borrow something, feel free to ask me. A few days later, sure enough, he comes, he asks him for a pot. And then when he returns it to him, he brings him a small pot. And again, he has the same story that I had a baby. So again, Yankel has no questions. He says, no problem, thank you. I appreciate your honesty. The next time he comes around and he says, can I please borrow from you a chandelier, an expensive chandelier? He takes it from him, he brings it home, and he never shows up again. So this Yankel is waiting impatiently to receive back his chandelier, and he's also expecting some baby with it. And nothing shows up. So he goes to his neighbor. He says, "What happened? Where's my chandelier?" He says, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. I'm so sorry, but your chandelier died." That chandelier died? What are you talking about? Chandeliers don't die. He said, "Well, if spoons and pots can have babies and you don't doubt it and you don't ask any questions, then chandeliers can die." This is a parable that brings out that when we add, we think, "Oh, it's so nice," but ultimately that will lead to someone to subtract. Once you play around with the rules and you say, "This, I'm doing a little better, it will cause the person to do a little less as well. Therefore, do the bare minimum and don't become more knowledgeable than God in what one should do. Let's read the summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read summary of the first idea.
We have covered big idea number one. The written and oral Torah is divine and perfect. Therefore, there is a prohibition of later rabbis to add or subtract the mitzvah.
Yeah, great. Okay, perfect. So this is the establishing the foundation that the Torah doesn't change. Now let's see idea number two, that rabbis do innovate. Rabbis do have additions that they make. So where does this fall in to that previous law that we just gave that the Torah doesn't change? So Caroline, if you'd like to read the introduction to section 2.
Innovative rabbis, big idea number two. In addition to interpreting the Torah, Torah scholars throughout the generations also instituted laws that do not have a textual basis in the Torah. In fact, the Torah itself commands the sages to legislate new laws in the following two categories. A, rules that will protect Torah law, and B, laws that make a general and vague Torah principle more concrete. Then there are additional mitzvot the rabbis enacted as praise to God.
Very good. So we're going to go through these ideas and explain them. But these are the three areas where rabbis do innovate and do have laws. Again, they're not changing the Torah, but these three categories are where they're allowed to, and we're going to explain. So, Sheila, if you'd like to read these few lines before we get to text 4.
Rabbis as legislators.
Yeah.
In the last session, we compared the rabbis to justices. Their role is simply to apply the law and communicate the word of God. They're just calling balls and strikes. However, the truth is that rabbis do indeed have another role, that of the legislator. They enact rabbinic institutions and mitzvahs.
Okay, let's pause there for a moment. So this is where the rabbis have their own innovation. Besides for being the justices for Torah law, they are allowed to be legislators regarding their own laws. Let's ask a few questions for a moment. Sheila, can you name me a few things that are done on Shabbat? Anything that you've seen, been practicing by Jewish people on Shabbat?
Oh, you don't answer the phone. You don't drive. You pray. You if there's a minyan, you take out the Torah.
Very good.
You light candles on Friday night.
Beautiful. Okay, so from those things you mentioned, praying on Shabbat, specifically the prayers that we do on Shabbat, reading the Torah, lighting Shabbat candles, are all rabbinic enactments. Those are all rabbinic laws. Not driving a car or not answering the telephone, those are biblical, and it exactly depends on how the phone is made, but assuming a regular phone and car, those are biblical prohibitions. So this was just to point out that some of the basic fundamentals that we have in Shabbat that we're familiar with are actually rabbinic decrees that were brought about, and we'll explain why momentarily. But I'll give you some other ones, which are making kiddush on wine, meaning saying the blessing on wine, that's a rabbinic enactment, eating Shabbat meals, eating 2 challah loaves after we make kiddush on Shabbat. So having 2 loaves of challah, that's not even a rabbinic law, that's a custom. And the fact that we have Havdalah over wine, at the end of Shabbat, we say a blessing over a cup of wine. biblically, we just have to say a few verses, and in the prayers suffices. The fact that we do kiddush over wine and havdalah over wine, that is a rabbinic enactment. The fact that we light the fire and the besamim, the smelling of herbs at the end of Shabbat, that's also rabbinic enactment. Let's take another area, and that is blessings. Caroline, if you can think of, off the top of your head, different blessings that we say to God, whether it's food or other things.
Like blessed are you, O Lord our God, who chose us among all the peoples and gave us the Torah. Blessed are we, the Lord our God. We say the blessings for the angels to come and protect us and to be with us. We say a blessing so the angels will come and be with us. We bless the seraphim, and we do the Shema, like to acknowledge the supreme authority of God.
Yeah, very good, very good. So we have those blessings that you mentioned, like the blessing before the Shema and after the Shema. There's blessings before we eat any food. We say a blessing after we eat food. There's
we
blessings,
wash our hands.
right? Correct. Blessings for washing hands. Blessings if we see a rainbow, lightning, thunder. All these blessings are all rabbinic enactments. They are not mentioned in the Torah. Nowhere in the Torah does God say a blessing when you wash your hands. But yet, it's something that's very popular, something that we do, something that most Jewish people are aware of, even if some laws in the Torah they're not aware of. Many of the rabbinic enactments are very popular. So we clearly see that what the rabbis instituted became a part of what we're comfortable and what we're used to when it comes to Judaism. The other big one is the holidays. Some biblical holidays are less known than Hanukkah or Purim, which are rabbinic holidays that were set up later. So we have really the question, wait a minute, how could the rabbis institute so much when it comes to Shabbat and when it comes to the blessings and when it comes to prayers and the Jewish holidays? Didn't we just say that the Torah is perfect? The Torah doesn't need any adding to it, doesn't need any explanation, it doesn't need any deduction, and it doesn't need any additions. What are the rabbis doing? Why are they enacting new things in the Torah if the Torah is apparently supposed to be a closed, perfect book? So this is where we're going to get into the areas of what the rabbis are trying to do when they're adding something. Let's read over here, Caroline, if you'd like to do putting up fences and then text floor.
Okay. Putting up fences, not adding. Rabbinic mitzvot come in one of two general categories. First is as a fence to the Torah. An example of a fence is not mixing poultry and milk. Look at this verse as it appears in the Torah. Do not cook a kid goat in its mother's milk.
Very good. So let's dissect one example. Here we have a book of Exodus. God tells us don't cook a kid, which a kid over here is referring to a small
baby goat,
a baby goat in its mother's milk. That is what the Torah says. Now, what is included in this prohibition? Is fowl, chicken, for example, is that included? Turkey, is that included in this prohibition or not?
Yes.
So, correct. So today we include it, but let's read how we got to this stage in order to understand what happened. So Sheila, if you'd like to read indeed, and then we'll go on to text 5.
Indeed, the rabbis prohibit certain behavior because engaging in them will ultimately lead a person to transgress Torah itself. In the following text, Maimonides explains just how it is that the rabbis could add these laws, yet they are not considered additions to the Torah.
Okay, let's pause over here just for one moment and I'll explain. So in certain areas, the rabbis do enact rabbinic institutions, but they're not Torah laws, they're rabbinic laws. Why are they adding these laws? let's use this as an example. We insure our car and we insure our home, but we don't insure the toilet paper that we buy. Besides for the fact that eventually we flush it down the toilet, but let's assume things that we don't even flush, the box of tissues, you don't insure it because it's not that valuable. It's not that important. Things that are important, we want to make sure we're always going to have. The Torah is so important to us, we want to make sure we don't even accidentally transgress the prohibitions of the Torah. So the very fact that we set up precautions shows how devoted, how interested, and how precious these commandments are to us that we don't even want to transgress them by mistake. So it's sort of like a fence. What the rabbis are instituting is a fence stopping someone from going to a place where he shouldn't go on his own. However, without a fence, he might go there by mistake. So if this fence was on the top of a cliff or at a place that was dangerous, or if it was your neighbor's property, you don't have permission to go, they are not coming to add, they're coming to protect us from going into the place that we're not supposed to. So if I were, let's look at this picture. And can you see from the picture, are these hot dogs beef hot dogs or are they chicken hot dogs?
No.
Can't tell.
Right, you can't tell. The answer is no one knows, which is why the rabbis came to this conclusion, that even though biblically only meat is prohibited, they prohibited chicken too, not as a biblical law, because they cannot change biblical law, but they said we need to make a fence for the people. People are unaware of differences, and they were realizing that people were making a mistake. Therefore, they said, in order to not have anyone be confused, we will prohibit anything that looks like the beef that was prohibited by the Torah. So let's read the way Maimonides explains this brilliantly, and he really clarifies this. So Sheila, if you'd like to continue with text 5.
A court has the authority to issue a decree and forbid something which is permitted and have to, its degree perpetuated for generations to come. What then it is the meaning of the scriptural prohibition. Do not add to it or do not detract from it. The intent is that they do not have the authority to add to the words of the Torah or to detract from them, establishing a matter forever as part of the scriptural law. This applies both to the written law and the oral law.
Okay, continue. It's a longer paragraph.
Oh. For example, the Torah states, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. The Torah forbade both the cooking and eating of meat and milk. The meat of chicken, by contrast, is permitted to be cooked in milk according to the scriptural law. Now, if a court will come and permit partaking of the meat of the wild animal cooked in milk, it is detracting from the Torah. And if it forbids the meat of the chicken cooked in milk, saying that it is included in the kid forbidden by the scriptural law, it is considered adding to the Torah. If, however, the court says the meat of the fowl cooked in milk is permitted according to scriptural law, we, however, are prohibiting it and publicizing the prohibition as a decree, lest the matter lead people to say, just as eating chicken cooked in milk is permitted because it is not explicitly forbidden by the Torah, so too the meat of wild animal cooked in milk is permitted because it is also not explicitly forbidden. And another will come and say, even the meat of the goat is permitted when cooked in milk of the cow or a sheep. For the verse mentions only its mother, i.e., an animal from the same species. For these reasons, we forbid all meat cooked in milk, even meat from fowls. Such an approach is not adding to the Torah, instead is creating safeguards for the Torah. Similar concepts apply in all analogous situations.
Very good. So let's explain what we just read here. The Torah says, don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. Moses explained at the time that God used an example of a goat in its mother's milk, but for the same price, you're not allowed to cook a deer in its mother's milk, a cow in its mother's milk, sheep, or any kosher animal cannot be cooked in any milk, not just its mother's milk. That's the way Moses explained the law. So it includes wild animals and it includes domesticated animals. However, Moses said it does not include chicken and turkeys or any fowl. Birds are okay. So the rabbis came ahead and they said, we do not have the right to say God prohibited eating chicken and milk. God did not. They don't have the right to change it. However, what they can say is, we realize that people are making a mistake. And if we allow people to eat chicken and milk, they'll say, well, chicken seems to me just like meat, because I can't tell the difference in between beef franks and chicken franks. Or this is, of course, before the time of franks, but people were not able to tell so much of the difference between chicken and meat. So one will come and say, hey, if the Torah prohibits meat, and yet I'm eating chicken with milk and I've seen rabbis eat it, must be that the Torah is only prohibiting the example that it gives, but everything else is permitted. So a cow in its mother's milk is permitted, or a wild animal in its mother's milk is permitted. It's just the young goat in its mother's milk that's prohibited. And that's incorrect. So because the rabbis were worried that one will misinterpret the law, therefore they said, we are making a separate boundary just in order to make sure that you don't come to transgress what the Torah said. We're going to tell you to take a boundary a step before to make sure that you don't get to doing what's wrong biblically. So it's like a parent telling their child that's learning how to drive, legally, you maybe can do certain things. However, me as a parent, I want to be extra precautious. I'm not telling you that it's against the law. I'm just telling you that I want you to be more careful because I don't want you to, by mistake, pass the law. And therefore, I'm going to prohibit something a step earlier. If you were to ask that parent, is this the law in the country? He would say, no, it's not. But this is just a boundary, a fence that I'm making for my child in order to make sure that they don't come to something that's completely illegal. Okay, so Caroline, if you'd like to read the summary over here, the reason.
The reason the rabbis must do this is because while the Torah is perfect, human beings are not. Therefore, rabbis over generations have enacted decrees to ensure that Torah will be kept. The Torah requests it. Where did the rabbis get this idea to create a fence around the Torah? From the Torah itself.
Yeah, okay, continue. Yeah.
Okay. The Torah contains a long list of relatives that are off limits for sexual relations. The rabbi then added on more relatives. For example, the Torah law forbids a male from a sexual relationship with his mother. The rabbis added that one's mother is also forbidden.
Mother's mother.
That the mother's mother is also forbidden. The Talmud probes for the source of the rabbi's additions. Talmud Tractate Yevamot. Rabbah said there is a prohibition against secondary forbidden relationships hinted in the Torah. Rav Kahana said the prohibition of secondary forbidden relationships is eluded from here. In the verse stated that the conclusion of the verses discussing the halakot of forbidden relationships. Therefore, shall you protect Ushamartim, my prized possession, Mishmarti, that you do not do any of these abominable customs. This means establish a safeguard, a mishmeret for my prized possession.
Very good. So to explain, if one were to come to the rabbis and the rabbis prohibited marrying one's mother's mother, and one were to say, well, rabbis, are you saying that the Torah prohibits the mother's mother? If the rabbi would say, yes, the Torah prohibits it, he would be transgressing the Torah. The Torah says, do not add to the Torah. But the rabbi could say, the Torah allows it. However, we understood that if we allow it to go through and people would marry the mother's mother, we realized that it was bringing certain problems in the way people interpret other prohibitions. So whenever they notice that this is an area that needs some adjustments and needs some extra restrictions regarding those laws, which is something that's done in society today all days, there's always the legislators in every state sitting and saying, we realize that this is a law, a loophole. This is an area where people are making a mistake. This is an area where people are not exactly being as careful as they should be. So we're going to have to make a boundary, a level prior, in order to stop people from transgressing something more serious. And it's hinted to in the Torah. The Torah tells us in Leviticus that you should protect my commandments, meaning God is saying, make a boundary before my commandments. Make a protection that you don't even come close to transgressing my commandment. Let's give a few examples to this concept. We'll start with this example, and then I'll give a few more. So, is one allowed to climb a tree on Shabbat? The answer is that biblically, you're allowed to climb a tree. The Torah prohibits 39 base melachot, base forms of work. One of them is cutting. So you're not allowed to break off a branch from a tree. You're not allowed to cut something from its source. However, climbing a tree is not a problem. However, the rabbis noticed that when people were climbing trees, they tend to break things off the tree, either accidentally or intentionally. So they said, the Torah doesn't prohibit climbing a tree on Shabbat. We will prohibit climbing a tree on Shabbat in order that you don't come to transgress what the Torah prohibits. That is not going against the Torah. That's doing exactly what the Torah wants you to do. The Torah wants you to protect yourself, do whatever you need to make sure you don't come close to doing something prohibited. The example we gave before is along the same lines. Don't mix chicken and milk. It's not a biblical prohibition. The rabbi said don't do it in order that you don't come to mix meat and milk. Another easy example is not to touch a pen or money on Shabbat. Biblically, one is allowed to touch a pen on Shabbat. They're just not allowed to write with it. There's a prohibition on Shabbat to write, but to touch a pen is okay. I didn't write anything. One is allowed to touch money on Shabbat because you didn't do anything with it. You're prohibited from writing, which is associated with buying and selling. Back in the day, when someone would touch money and buy and sell, they would always follow it up with a receipt, a handwritten receipt. The rabbi said, we noticed that when people were touching pens on Shabbat, or people were touching and dealing with money, buying and selling, they would then by mistake forget and write on Shabbat. So therefore, we're prohibiting one from touching a pen, lest he come to write with it. We're prohibiting one with dealing with money on Shabbat, cash I'm talking about. If it's electronics, like credit cards, it could be different. But just to touch dollar bills on its own is not a biblical prohibition, meaning the Torah doesn't say do not touch dollar bills. The Torah prohibits writing. And the rabbi saw that when people were dealing with money, they were writing, so they said don't deal with money on Shabbat. I'll give another example. Let's see over here a few of the slides. Not to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it falls out on Shabbat. On the New Year, we always blow the shofar, but when it falls out on the Sabbath, in all congregations all over the world, we don't blow the shofar. We blow it on the next day. The second day of Rosh Hashanah, which is Sunday, we'll blow it then. Biblically, there's no prohibition with blowing a shofar on the holiday. But the rabbis realized that there is a prohibition from carrying a shofar on Shabbat outside in a public domain. So biblically, if one wanted to blow the shofar on Shabbat that falls out on Rosh Hashanah, they bring the shofar to the synagogue prior to Shabbat, and then they can blow on Shabbat without a problem. The problem was, the rabbis noticed, that people were not bringing it before Shabbat, and they said, if we're blowing it today, then surely we're allowed to carry it outside. And they were transgressing the Shabbat and bringing it outside from their home to the synagogue on Shabbat, which was also Rosh Hashanah, and they were going against the Torah law of carrying outside on Shabbat. Therefore, the rabbi said, we're going to cancel and tell people not to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat, not because we say this is what the Torah wants, But because the Torah wants us to be careful to make sure that we don't transgress the Torah, and because this was causing people to transgress, we're going to say not to blow on the first day, only blow on the second day, in order that one should not come to go against Torah law. Again, if we were to ask the rabbis, is this a Torah prohibition? The answer is absolutely not. But it's a rabbis seeing a problem and trying to solve it before it gets out of hand. Another example, this is a story we mentioned in previous classes of Amnon and Tamar, two children from King David, that they were secluded together in a private area, and eventually it led to sin. Therefore, the rabbis enacted that even though biblically the only prohibition is having intimate relations with someone that you're not married to, everything else is okay. But the rabbis realized that the step before one sinning with prohibited relations is being secluded in a private area with the other gender. So therefore they said, in order to protect one from going into a situation which will be too difficult to get out of and they might come to do a sin, don't even find yourself secluded in a private area with someone of the opposite gender, which means don't be locked up in a room. If it's an open room or if it's during the daytime and people can walk in or out, that's fine. If it's in a place where someone can walk in at any random time, that's okay. But if one travels to a hotel and they're going with their coworker or colleague in a hotel room together, that is a prohibition because no one's expected to come in and you're being secluded with someone from the other gender. You might not sin, however, you might sin. And because the rabbis realized that all those or most of those that were sinning with this prohibition were first finding themselves secluded, they said, don't be secluded in a private area. Another one is not to have chametz, the prohibited food, right before Passover, because it might lead to someone to have it during the beginning of Passover. So the Torah only prohibits it on Passover. The rabbi said even a little before the Torah prohibition, we will prohibit one from eating it in order that they shouldn't lead to making a mistake. We'll give one last example, and that is regarding food that a non-Jew bakes or cooks. Certain foods, which are respectable foods, foods that one would invite their friend for, one that we serve on a king's table, that cannot be eaten raw. So for example, a piece of chicken or a piece of meat, even if it's kosher, if a non-Jew cooks it for you, the rabbis said we're prohibiting one from partaking in that chicken, because when a non-Jew cooks something for you and invites you over for a meal, it causes friendship. It causes that you should start intermingling, and it might lead to intermarriage. They realized that those that were end up marrying people outside of the faith started off with being too friendly and going out for meals together. So even though biblically, as long as the food is kosher, you can eat it, the rabbi said when a non-Jew cooks the food, don't eat it, because that will lead you to eventually, possibly, going against the Torah prohibition of marrying someone from the other faith. So these are examples where, to clarify, the rabbis are not changing the Torah. They're saying the Torah doesn't change. However, we realize that there's a problem, so we're making a fence, and this is what the Torah wants us to do, to make a fence before one transgresses the serious sin. Let's read, Sheila, if you'd like to read, it's still only a fence, and then text 7.
Even as we observe these rabbinic enactments, there must be clear differentiation between the essence of the Jewish legal system, the actual mitzvah of the Torah, and the rabbinic enactments which are meant to protect these mitzvahs. The rabbis must make it clear that their institutions are not biblical command and that the Torah remains untampered. This emerges from another early source regarding creating prohibitions to safeguard the mitzvah. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot lists this as a major teaching of the Anshel Knesset Hagedorah, the men of the Great Assembly, Avadei Rebbe Natan Tashefta, which expands on Pirkei Avot, explains this idea by means of analogy, emphasizing the need for rabbinic enactments while also warning on the dangers involved. The next one.
Yeah. So here's
Okay.
the text.
Okay, here's the text from Rabbi. Okay, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah.
There you go. So let's focus on what we're bringing out. They say three things. The first one is be patient in the administration of justice, which means don't jump to conclusions when you're a judge, a police officer, an investigator. Always take your time and say, maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe I made a mistake with my knowledge about the case or my knowledge about the law. Always re-verify that you have the up-to-date laws and that you understand the scenario really well. The next statement they say is raise many disciples, meaning one shouldn't say, I just need one or two disciples and that's enough. These will be the ones that will know everything I know, because you never know who from your disciples will be the next leader, the next teacher. And therefore you have to invest in many disciples, not just a few, because they might not be successful and the Torah will be forgotten. And the last thing they say is, which is what we're focused on, is make a fence around the Torah, meaning make prohibitions when necessary, rabbinic prohibitions, in order to prevent one from going against the serious transgressions of the Torah. So there's Avot Rabbi Natan. He explains this rule that the rabbis are giving us, and let's read in text 8. Caroline, please.
Avot de Rabbi Natan expands. Avot de Rabbi Natan. Make a fence around the Torah. A vineyard that is enclosed within a fence cannot be compared to a vineyard that is not enclosed with a fence. A person should not make the fence more important than the primary item, such as that if the fence falls, he simply cuts down the vines. This is what occurred with Adam, who thought of the fence as more important than the vineyard, and therefore when the fence fell, he cut down the vines.
Okay, and let's read this explanation.
The analogy from Adam is that even though God only instructed him not to eat, he added a fence and told Eve not even to touch. However, he was not careful to discriminate between the actual command and his addition. This led the serpent to push Eve into the tree and force her to touch it. When nothing happened, the serpent argued that just as nothing happened when you touched it, so will nothing happen when you eat. On the one hand, the vineyard without a fence is unprotected, and the vines will eventually get ruined. Therefore, we need the rabbinic enactments as a fence to protect the mitzvot of the Torah. However, there is a danger that a person will become so occupied with the fence that he will forget about the main item, which is the vineyard. Accordingly, we must always realize that the mitzvot of the Torah are central and the rabbinic enactments are intended to protect them.
Very good. So he explains here that, yes, make a fence, but make it well aware that this is a fence. If one does not, which is what Adam did, one did not explain, Adam didn't tell Eve, I'm warning you, even though God says do not eat. I'm telling you don't touch it, because by doing so, he actually messed it up. Because Eve said, God said don't even touch it. The snake came and started playing clever with him. Said, well, God said don't touch it and don't eat it, right? According to the way you're saying it to Eve. He pushes Eve into the tree and Eve touched it by mistake and she didn't die. He said, look, it's false. So too what God said, do not eat it, is also false, because clearly you touched it and you didn't die. So this is where when one adds and doesn't explain that it's their addition, it makes the other think that everything is the same. And if this isn't important, nothing is important. So the rabbis must, and in each and every scenario, we don't want to get in the way of God versus our logic. And we have to differentiate and say, this is what God said, and this is no logic involved. It's above our logic. The next thing is what we're adding in because of our mind. This is what we think is important. By saying clearly what's what allows the people not to make the mistake and assume that everything is from God. And therefore, if this actually didn't fulfill itself, everything is garbage. It's like one saying the wall around the vineyard is really important. It's so important that if the wall falls, then the whole vineyard's worth nothing. That would be false. Yes, the wall is really important. You can't compare a vineyard with a wall to one without a wall. However, even if the wall falls, there's still good quality trees inside, and try to protect it as much as possible. Don't destroy the trees just because you lost your wall. Okay, let's read, Sheila, if you'd like to read another enactment.
Another enactment defining the Torah's command. There is another category of enactments that are almost entirely original. These are rabbinic mitzvah that are in the spirit of the Torah, rabbinic manifestations of the Torah's greater ideal. Once again, the rabbis will never add to the Torah. They will have to make it clear that these laws are not mandated by the Torah, but rather a rabbinic innovation. At times, a mitzvah in the Torah is formulated in a broad manner without concrete expression or examples. The rabbis then made sure to concretize and practically apply these mitzvahs. Some of these manifestations of Torah are more closely related to the original command than others.
Very good. So he's saying another area where the rabbis are giving their input is when they're defining a very general commandment. So let's use as an example. He brings here an example that brings out this point of rabbis giving us very detailed commandments, but they're not making this up from nowhere. They're defining a very broad commandment from God. So Sheila, if you'd like to continue.
Maimonides explains that the rabbis gave the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself, very concrete expression. It is positive commandment of rabbinic origin to visit the sick, comfort mourners, to prepare for a funeral, prepare a bride, accompany guests, attend to all the needs of a burial, carry a corpse on one's shoulders, walk before the pyre, mourn, dig a grave, and bury the dead, and also to bring joy to a bride and groom and help them in all their needs. These are needs of kindness that one carries out with his person that have no limit. Although all these mitzvah are of rabbinic origin, they are included in the scriptural commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. That charge implies that whatever you would like other people to do for you, you should do for your peers.
Very good. So what he's explaining here is the rabbis took a commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, and they gave it very definitive commandments in what one should do. They said, visit the sick, comfort the mourners. If you look in the Torah, it doesn't say anywhere that you should prepare for a funeral or you should help a bride get married or accompany your guest outside. But the rabbis explained, not by making this up, but by tradition, and this was their authority, to say what is included in the commandment, love your neighbor. And so too, another example is prayer. God says pray, according to most opinions, it's a general commandment, and the rabbis defined it as to when we should pray, for how long, what are the texts that one should say. So this is another aspect where it appears to be a rabbinic enactment, but they're really just explaining and defining a very general principle in the Torah. Let's look at another area where the rabbis are giving their input, and Caroline, Torah values.
Torah values. In the above examples, even though the body, the mitzvah, is rabbinic, it is very much a manifestation of the Torah's actual mitzvah. But there are instances where the enactments of the rabbis are less direct manifestations of biblical commands and instead are in the spirit of the Torah. A classic example of this concept is a reciting of the bracha before eating. The Talmud Titre Brachot 35. Concerning the fundamental basis for blessings, the Germania asks, from where are these matters, the obligation to recite a blessing before eating derived? The fundamental obligation to recite a blessing over food is founded on one reason. One is forbidden to derive benefit from this world without a blessing.
Very good. So the rabbis took an idea of respecting the property of another, asking permission before, and they said, well, everything in the world belongs to God, so we must ask him permission, acknowledge his right over the item before we partake in it. And we have here other commentaries which bring the same idea out from other places, from other laws. Sheila, if you'd like to read Maimonides and then text 11.
Maimonides articulates the idea that all laws of bracha are rooted in this assumption, this Torah value. Maimonides' Mishnah Torah law of blessings 1:4. Thus, all blessings can be divided into three categories. A, blessings over benefit, like eating and drinking. B, blessings over mitzvah. C, blessing reciting as expression of praise and thanks to God as a means of petition. The reason for these blessings is so that we will always remember the Creator and fear him.
Very good. So Maimonides says, what is the reason for blessings? In addition to what the Talmud mentioned of asking God permission, which applies to when we're partaking of items for pleasure, he says in general, it's all about remembering God constantly so that we will fear him, which means we will oblige to his commandments. Let's see here another source that brings out, again, an explanation for this idea. And Caroline, if you'd like to read text 13, which is based on a verse of text 12, but it has it in text 13.
Okay. The Midrash on this verse launches into a discussion about laws of blessing. Midrash Telahim, I am ever mindful of God's presence. Rab said, this teaches us that when making a blessing, one must mention God's name and say, blessed are you, God.
So the Midrash is connecting the two concepts of remembering God, being mindful of God, and the enactment of blessings whenever we partake of something. Another example would be the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim. It's natural we want to praise God, and these are two great miracles God performed for us, saving us from our enemies. Therefore, they set up a system where we celebrate these holidays. This is a longer piece from Maimonides, but I'll explain it just outside because we're running a little bit low on time. Maimonides says there's 613 commandments from God, but then there's other commandments that the rabbis enacted. These additional commandments are not adding to the Torah because rabbis never said this is what God commanded. Rather, they said we are adding something on our own, either as a precautionary fence, or we're adding it in order to thank God. For example, the holiday of Purim or the holiday of Hanukkah, then they are allowed to because they're clearly stating that it's their own initiative. It's something that they want to do on their own, to the degree that even when they do that, we're still allowed to say that it's God's commandment. We'll explain it momentarily in another quote we'll have here from Maimonides, that you can still say, thank you, God, for giving us the commandment of lighting the Hanukkah candles, even though God never said you should light it. But ultimately, the rabbis instituted it not as a biblical commandment, but as a way to thank God. So too, all commandments from the rabbis are their way of not changing the Torah, but giving additional boundaries or additional blessings, praises to God. The next text over here, we have in text 15 again. Here is where he explains how could we say a blessing, thank you, God, for giving us the commandment. And he said, the answer is because God tells us in the Torah, act according to the judgment they relate to you. Meaning God tells us in the Torah, listen to what the rabbis tell you and act accordingly. So it's like God gives us 613 commandments, and then he gives us one of those 613 is whatever the rabbis will tell you that you should do in addition to the Torah as their judgment. You should also follow that. So when we make a blessing on Hanukkah, thank you, God, for giving us the commandment to light Hanukkah, even though God never said you should, what we're saying is God told us to listen to the rabbis in each generation, and they told us to light the Hanukkah candles. So it's like God told us to light it because God says, listen to what the rabbis say. So that's why we could even put this blessing in, because ultimately it's what God wanted. So this section 2 is giving us the insight as to where rabbinic commandments come in. Section 1, we said Torah doesn't change. Section 2 says, yes, the rabbis can add in certain areas where they're not saying this is Torah law, but they're clearly stating it's rabbinic law. Let's read the summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read summary from idea number 2.
We have covered big idea number 2. In addition to interpreting the Torah scholars throughout the generations also instituted new laws that do not have a textual basis in the Torah. In fact, the Torah itself commands the sages to legislate new laws in the following 2 categories: rules that will protect Torah law and laws that make a general and vague Torah principle more concrete. Then there are additional mitzvah the rabbis enacted as praise to God.
Very good. Now we're going to go on to point number 3 and see how, even with the rabbi's enactment, how much the people have the power. Ultimately, it's the power. And Caroline, if you'd like to read the introduction.
Power to the people. The power of rabbis to institute new laws stems from the Jewish people. A number of elements demonstrate this truth. Number 1, rabbinic legislation is not considered valid if it lacks the consensus of the people. 2, there is a strong notion of customs, minhagim, in Jewish law. 3, when there is uncertainty about a law, we observe what the people are doing and assume that it is the correct haklah. This is because people are naturally in sync with God due to their mutual love.
Okay, so what this is, the third idea is explaining that as much as the rabbis seemingly have authority and power, it's not their power, but it's really the power of the people. They're just representing the people. So the rabbis cannot make up things on their own without the acceptance from the people as well. When it comes to all holidays, for example, even the holiday of Purim, where it says clearly in the Megillah that the rabbis wanted to institute it, Mordechai and Esther wanted to set up a holiday, and the Jews accepted it, and therefore it became a holiday. So when it comes to judging, let me make this clear, when it comes to Torah law, we don't ask the people what's their opinion. Law is the law, and we have to follow it. This is where it makes absolutely no difference whether the people like the ruling or not. Where does it make a difference? It's when we're referring to specifically the rabbis making something new on their own, when the rabbis are legislators, not justices, like we gave that analogy before. That is where their role is merely representatives of the people. Let's read over here the first quote from Maimonides. Sheila, if you'd like to read text 16.
When a court sees it necessary to issue a decree, institute an edict, or establish a custom, they must first contemplate the matter and see whether or not the majority of the community can uphold the practice. We never issue a decree on the community unless the majority of the community can uphold the practice. If a court issued a decree thinking that the majority of the community could uphold it, and if the decree was issued, the majority of the community raised contentions and the practice did not spread throughout the majority of the community, the decree is nullified. The court cannot compel the people to accept it. Say the sages issue a decree and thought that it spread among the entire Jewish people, and the situation remained unchanged for many years. After a long duration of time, another court arose and checked throughout the Jewish community and saw that the observance of the decree had not spread throughout the Jewish community. It now has the authority to negate the decree, even if it is a lesser stature than the original court in wisdom and in number of adherents.
But he says here clearly that the rabbis, if they make a decree, even if it's to protect from transgression of the Torah, if at the time the majority of the community did not uphold it, they didn't follow, or if later on we notice that most of the community is not doing it, then the decree is annulled because their only job is to represent the people. We'll use an example we have here a short video, but we're short on time, so we'll skip the video. But the example of when they outlawed alcohol, they saw that it wasn't working and it was just causing more crime, that eventually they said, you know what, forget it. We're going to make it legal. Similar idea is what we have in Judaism. But let's understand, how does this work? That if the rabbis have the authority to make a decree, then why is it that if no one listens, the decree goes away? So this is because, what is this concept of the rabbis enacting or people making a custom? Customs in Judaism play a great role. We don't say, well, God gave us the Torah and that's it. There's no need for customs. Customs show how much we on our own want to do something, even though we're not commanded to do and we're not obligated. I love you so much, I'm still going to go ahead and do it. If you're married to your spouse and every day they ask you something and you say, well, did we sign on that in our marriage document or not? And that will decide if I'm going to do it or not. That's a relationship that's okay, but it's not a great relationship. A good relationship is where you want to do things on your own. This is where customs come in, where people say we're not responsible, but we want to do it. So here the Talmud gives an example of a custom a community had not to travel on Friday. They said, we want to prepare for Shabbat, so we're not going to travel on Friday. And the rabbi tells the descendants to uphold that custom, even though it's not mandatory. Jewish law allows you to travel on Friday to a certain degree. There's laws about that. But he said, because it's a good custom, keep it. Customs get a certain strength once people accept it upon themselves. Here we have a similar quote from Maimon, the father of Maimonides, and he says that we shouldn't diminish, we shouldn't make fun or mock any type of Jewish custom that was accepted in the majority of the Jewish communities. For example, this is going back 900 years ago. He says the custom of eating donuts on Hanukkah. He says because it's fried in oil, we want to remember the miracle of oil. Don't say, oh, this is probably just some guys that were looking to party and they wanted some good food and they blamed it on the miracle. No, once it becomes a custom of the Jewish people, because we're going to bring this out, the source momentarily, but because the Jewish people are ultimately connected with God, when they accept something upon themselves, we shouldn't embarrass it and put it down or mock it. We should understand that if it's God's nation that chose it, it's because of their love to God. Therefore, we should also keep up those customs that were taken upon them, not because we're responsible to, but it has a certain importance. It's showing the love that someone initiates on their own. Over here, the Talmud gives another example where they had a dispute. What blessing do we make when one drinks water? And the rabbis say, you want to find out what's the final verdict? Go see what the masses are doing. This is very strange. Why would they decide a law based on what the masses are doing? What happens if most people are making a mistake? When, of course, the rabbis are sure what the law is, they don't need to see what everybody's doing. And just because everybody breaks the law doesn't mean the law changes. But when there's a dispute, when we're not sure, we say the Jewish people love God. And if they're going to do something, clearly they're going to be doing it the right way because of God's love to them. God will make sure that they end up on the right path. So they resolved their disagreement on what blessing to make based on what everybody is doing, based on what the masses were, how they were practicing. Let's read text 20. And Caroline, if you'd like to read this, as to why what everybody is doing becomes the law when we're in doubt.
Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Hagiz explains the basis for trusting the masses. This is a fundamental principle in halakha. If the correct halakha is unclear to you, go out and observe what the people are doing and act accordingly. For it is obvious that due to God's love for his people, he will remove all missteps from their paths.
Yeah. So it's because of God's love to the Jewish people that he guides the intuition of the masses to go in the right direction. If we think of it as great companies like Nike, for example, they invite sometimes by a new product, the average fellow, not the big researcher or someone that's involved in fashion, but they'll take the average people on the street to test their products, give them feedback, and see what they could change, what they can do better. So it's not always the smartest and the wisest that know the best decisions. Sometimes it's the intuition or common sense of the average man that actually will tell us the best way to go about it. So it's the love that God has for us and that we have for God, which ultimately puts us in sync with doing the right choice. And Caroline, if you'd like to read this text 21 that brings up this last point, and then we'll go to the summary.
Text 21, Rabbi Abram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook Elder Hayechar. One should know that we lovingly observe the customs of the Jewish people, even though we know that they lack a source in revealed prophecy. Rather, our observance of these customs is based on our love for our nation, which is connected to the holy love for God. Similarly, all the formal rabbinic enactments, an important principle regarding them is the acceptance of the nation, which means that it must spread throughout the entire Jewish people. The foundation of this approach is the deep connection that this nation has to God, unique and amazing in the annals of history, and therefore we have laws that stem from the acceptance of the nation, just as we have laws that are in the written Torah. Ultimately, the power of the rabbis to create laws flows from the power of the people. The special closeness that the Jewish people have with God lies in the Jewish nation.
So therefore, we value so much what people are doing. The rabbis don't have their own power. It's ultimately they're representing what the people are feeling in their connection to God. So let's read the summary of point number 3, just to summarize point number 1 and 2 again. 1, we said the Torah doesn't change. 2, with the Torah not changing, the rabbis can make boundaries. If they make it clear that it's their enactment, they can explain a general principle in the Torah in more detail, give it practical implications, and they can add times of praise to God. Summary number 3 is explaining that even this power of the rabbis is not really their own, how much God ultimately cares what the masses are doing. So Sheila, if you'd like to read summary.
The power of rabbis to institute new laws stems from the Jewish people. A number of elements demonstrate this truth. Rabbinic legislation is not considered valid if it lacks the consensus of the people. There is a strong notion of customs in Jewish law. When there is uncertainty about a law, we observe what the people are doing and assume that this is the correct halakha. This is because the people are naturally in sync with God due to their mutual love.
Very good. So ultimately, we need the people to accept the rabbinic laws. There's a strong notion of following what the custom is, even if it wasn't a law. And then ultimately, when there's uncertainty, that's the deciding factor. Let's read the summary of this whole class, or we'll pull up just this slide. We have the Torah is God talking to us, but the rabbinic mitzvot is us talking to God, us expressing our love that we have to God and looking for ways where we can say, I want to make this even better. So let's read the key points. We have here 3 pages of it. So we'll start with Sheila, if you'd like to read this page.
The Torah is perfect and unchangeable. We may not add to or subtract from Torah. Besides the rabbis acting as justice to apply the law, they, I can't see the word, have a role as legislators to write new laws. Much of Judaism, as we know, is rabbinic. The rabbis must make it clear that their enactments are not God's words. The rabbis make fences for Torah, prohibition made as a precaution against transgressing a real Torah law, according to a command from the Torah itself.
Very good. So the rabbis have to say it's our fence that we're making. Ultimately, everything else has to be from the Torah, which the Torah doesn't change. Even though, bottom line, what we practice today is a lot of the rabbinic stuff, but one has to know this is not the Torah. This is what the rabbis were instituting. Okay, Caroline, if you'd like to read the next points.
The rabbis give practical applications to Jewish values. 8, the rabbis institute rabbinic mitzvot that are in sync with Torah values. 9, this rule too is rooted in Torah, as the Torah states not to deviate from what the rabbis tell you. 10, this is to the extent that the blessing before a rabbinic mitzvah, we also say, blessed are you, our God, who has commanded us to, because God commanded us to obey the rabbis.
So this is a very important point. Whatever the rabbis say, it's not them trying to make up something new. It's what God wanted. God said, listen to what they say, not because I don't know what's going to be happening, but because we want a partnership, and I want you to put your input and make your boundaries for my commandments. You should tell me you want to celebrate a special holiday, even though I didn't command you. You want to make a boundary that's necessary. You want to thank God, and so forth. Let's read the last summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read this page.
The power of the rabbis as legislators ultimately is the power of the people. If the people never accepted the rabbinic institution, it is, I can't see that.
Invalid.
Okay. A minhag, even without basis, has legal weight. When the rabbis are uncertain about a certain halakha, I can't read that, people actually do is assumed to be the correct halakha. One reason for this is because God guides the intuition of the people. On a deeper level, the Jewish people are in sync with God, and God reveals his through them.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so that's the third and last part of the class. With that, we conclude this lovely class. Thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure to see you here.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, you're welcome. And
Toda rabba, Rabbi. Shavua
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Okay,
Yeah.
bye-bye.